Last week we began by introducing all of the minor prophets, so we're going to focus in on the book of Habakkuk under the theme of when God seems silent. Just want to highlight a couple of the things that we mentioned last time. There is great value in the minor prophets because they deal with weighty issues. They point the way towards the coming Messiah. They illustrate how God deals on the world scene, not just within his people Israel. New Testament references often the work of the minor prophets, and even Jesus quotes from them. When we talked about approaching and looking at what they have to say, we said we need to look at it within the historical framework of each of the authors, aware of their literary styles and the way that they approach their subject. Talked about the prophetic telescope. Many times the prophets talk about things near as well as things that are distant. Mentioned that prophecy really isn't so much about foretelling as it is forthtelling, giving the message of God, and how that God's message is designed to change. And so those were things that we covered last time. I'm excited to delve into this theme, but I'm really excited to look at this theme from the Old Testament book of Habakkuk. I asked you at the end of last week to, sometime this week, to concentrate and think of a time in your own life when you felt like God was silent. A time when it really perplexed you because God appeared to be silent. I hope you have a notebook. If you don't, I think there's some in the back there because we're going to actually begin with a little writing exercise this morning. I have 3 questions regarding the incident that you recalled. If you didn't do that, you have about 30 seconds to get that accomplished. I'm going to show you the 3 questions. Don't worry about starting because I'm just going to introduce them and then I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to answer, to respond to these 3 questions. But here are the 3 questions that I want you to think about in regard to the time when you are thinking about that God appeared to be silent. Number 1, during that time, why did you think God was silent? During that time, what was it that was going on that caused you to believe that God was silent? The second question is going to be this. What did that perceived silence do to your spirit? When you perceived that God was silent, what did that do to your inner spirit? And then the third question is going to be this. How did you seek relief from the void produced by your perception of God's absence? God was seeming silent because something was transpiring. Your spirit was feeling a certain way. What did you seek to do in response to fill the void? So those are the 3 questions.
Those listening to this via the media may wish to pause the video at this point, get a pen and paper, and record your answers to these questions. It will be important as we go forward from this point.
If you're willing, reducing your response to, if you will, a category. Okay? What kind of things were happening when you felt God was silent? Is there a one-word category that describes that? Let's hear some. Doubt, grief, fear, pain, why, hopelessness, delay. Good word. Okay, again, not a specific answer, but what kind of things happen to our spirit when we feel all of those things? That God is silent because of grief, delay, all of those different things that have been mentioned. What does that do to your spirit? One-word answers. Fear, weakness, lost, doubt, sad. Good answers. What did you do to generate relief? Pray. Remember past blessings. Scripture. Hope. Anyone seek a confidant? Counsel from someone else? Encouragement from others? I just want us to all understand that when it comes to the subject of God's silence, we're really talking about a subject that applies to every person in this room. We've all been presented with moments when we have felt God's silence. We have responded in very similar fashions. The words that were all used are pretty much synonyms, weren't they? We've all responded about the same way. We've all sought solution in the same fashion. John Newton an Englishman who was a songwriter, lyricist, poet. He's credited with saying, I'm not the man I ought to be. I'm not the man I wish to be. I'm not the man I hope to be. But by the grace of God, I'm not the man I used to be. And he had a very sordid life history. Probably you recognize that name because he wrote the amazing song, Amazing Grace. He also wrote Glorious Things of Thee Are Spoken. How sweet the name of Jesus sounds. And one might assume from the nature of those songs that this guy never felt God was very silent. You know, amazing grace, standing on the mountaintop, hearing the birds, watching the stream. Glorious things of thee are spoken. Well, the fact is, he also struggled many times with feeling the silence of God. In my reading and studying, I came across a song that he wrote entitled, I Asked the Lord That I Might Grow. Look at the lyrics. Now, the gist of the song is this. He's talking about communicating with God, but God's not answering the way he wants him to answer. So he's thinking God is silent, and then he ends out the last verse. The last verse is God's response to him. It's one of those songs you can't skip a verse to. So here it is. I asked the Lord that I might grow in faith and love and every grace, might more of his salvation know and seek more earnestly his face. That's what he's prayed for. 'Twas he who taught me thus to pray. This is how God taught me to pray, and he, I trust, has answered prayer, but it has been in such a way as almost drove me to despair. I ask, but God seems silent. I hope that in some favored hour at once he'd answer my request, and by his love's constraining power subdue my sins and give me rest. That's what I'm asking. Instead of this, he made me feel the hidden evils of my heart, and let the angry powers of hell assault my soul in every part. Yea, more with his own hand he seemed intent to aggravate my woe. Crossed all my fair designs I'd schemed, humbled my heart and laid me low. Lord, why is this? I trembling cried. Wilt thou pursue thy worm to death? 'Tis in this way, the Lord replied, I answer prayer for grace and faith. These inward trials I employ from self and pride to set thee free and break thy schemes of earthly joy, that thou mayst find thy all in me. God seems silent, and in the musical answer, Newton said God was silent so that I'd forget about my plans, my scheme, and I'd let God be my all in all. As we begin to look at this book of Habakkuk, this book echoes all three of the questions that we went through. This book is based upon the answers that you gave to those questions. This book is based upon a sense of God's silence. Why has God been inactive? What happened to Habakkuk's spirit because he perceived God's inactivity? And how did he seek relief? And those are some of the things that we're going to look at in the course of our study. In all probability, your answer to that very first question, the question about something that caused you to feel God's silence, in all probability, it has to do with some specific event that took place, perhaps something that happened to you, something happened in you, something happening around you. This is where the truths of Habakkuk find powerful personal application. In other words, this isn't just a theme for a series. This is Habakkuk dealing with a subject that's very personal to every person. So as we approach this study, I'm going to try to make it as personal as I can so that we get exactly what I think God intends for us to get out of this book. Let's begin by just looking at who this guy was. Just tell you right off, We, we don't know much at all about Habakkuk. His Hebrew name is put into English equivalents and it looks like that. And the CH in Hebrew gives you the ha, growling noise in your throat. So it actually is Habakkuk. Habakkuk. Now, some of you who may be in the future having a child, you may want to remember that because it might be a great opportunity. Someone comes up and looks at your newborn and says, what do we have here? And you could say, Habakkuk. Okay, last week I had a bad one. This week I had a worse one. The name means to embrace or to cling. To embrace or to cling. And that's an amazing understanding of who this guy is. Because on the negative side, we can see he's clinging to things, he's embracing things that are generating this turmoil, this sense of God's silence. And then on the good side of it, we can see that he's embracing these troubles to God where he can find his solution, his answer to those questions. The guess is he may have been in his 30s, and that's absolutely all that is a guess. There's not a whole lot that even substantiates that. He is, in the very first verse, it says Habakkuk the prophet, which some people believe indicates that he may have been one of those trained prophets. You know, back in Samuel, we find Samuel beginning this, if you will, the school of the prophet, I think is what some of the translations call it. But there was a formal training for prophets. And so that may be an indication that Habakkuk was trained as a prophet. Again, we really don't know, but that may be something. He was contemporary with Zephaniah, Jeremiah, and possibly Ezekiel and Daniel. The time of his work, again, is kind of uncertain. It's difficult to peg exactly. What we do know is that in the book, God speaks of the rising power of Babylon. We know that Babylon came up against Judah in 605 BC. So he worked before then, but as to exactly when it was, it's pretty hard to pinpoint. This is just a map showing at the time the power of Assyria. And then Babylon begins to take over that whole area, conquer Assyria, takes down Nineveh in 612 BC, which was the capital of Assyria. So Babylon is beginning to spread, and the book foretells that is coming. As we look to just summarizing the book, it's got 3 chapters. So we just, chapter 1 is faith tested, chapter 2 is faith taught, and chapter 3 is faith triumphant. As we look to the person Habakkuk, we find those chapters representing some things that happened to him on his spiritual journey. And again, the reason that's significant is because this whole book is talking about when God seems silent. So when that happened to Habakkuk, what was his journey? What was his process? A couple of different ways to look at that. In chapter 1, there's an argument that goes on. He addresses God with some of the things that are happening, and to him, God's silence is being demonstrated. He's not dealing with these things. So he moves from argument into receiving answers in chapter 2. And then finally, he ends up with acceptance and ends with a psalm, if you will, of acceptance. More words to do the same thing. In chapter 1, he's really wondering what in the world's happening, what's going on. In chapter 2, he is waiting. And then in chapter 3, he ends up worshiping. So he went through a process. And folks, that is so significant. And in the course of our series, I'll be hopefully mentioning this over and over and over again. We know the answer to God really isn't silent. But we've got to go through the process to get there. So it isn't enough just to say, I just need to have more faith. I had a dear brother. I mean, he was well up in age. And every question I asked in class, he'd raise his hand. And his answer was always the same. Brother Fraser, and that's what he called me. I'm not 30 years old, but I was Brother Fraser to him. Brother Fraser, we just need to have more faith. And I'm absolutely right. Every question. Brother Fraser, we just need to have more faith. That answered everything. And again, it does, but there's a process in getting there. The mustard seed has to grow. The mustard seed has to grow for the bird to nest in it. Yes, faith is the answer. But what we find in the book of Habakkuk, this guy's already a man of faith, but God appears silent to him, and he has to go through a process of recognizing God isn't silent. And so do I, and so do you. And it doesn't matter whether we've been to the school of the prophets and been highly trained, or if we're a brand new Christian. It doesn't matter. It's still the same process. And sometimes, especially when we know the end goal, we want to jump to the end without going through the process. And maybe that's the problem the Huskers are having right now. They want to jump to the end goal instead of doing the work that you have to do to get there. But sometimes that's what we do spiritually. That's what we do spiritually. Here are some of the changes that we can identify in the life of Habakkuk because he went through this process. He moved from fear to faith. He moved from being burdened to feeling blessing. He transformed himself from perplexity to praise. He went from confusion to confidence. And he traveled from worry to worship. So changes took place in him when he faced his feeling that God was silent. Does that sound like some changes that you might like to experience? Habakkuk is so unique because usually prophets were selected by God. Remember, they're just a spokesperson for God. Prophets were selected by God to present a divine message to destitute men. But Habakkuk doesn't have a message. As a matter of fact, Habakkuk ends up talking to God about people. Instead of from God to people, Habakkuk goes to God about people. The other prophets don't do that. Habakkuk is unique in that way. Prophets normally make a declaration for God, but Habakkuk has a dialogue with God. It's just a record of his dialogue with God when he felt the silence of God. One not so obvious truth that I think is foundational as we start to look at this book is the dangers in what I'm going to call inhumanizing our view of history. An underlying problem that Habakkuk had was that he saw history through his human perspective and nothing else. Habakkuk's worldview consumed him to the core. This prophet possessed a way of viewing history that held the power to dislocate his spirituality. This is a grave danger for us as well today. There's a lot of reading and discussion that can go on about various worldviews and how they affect our political choices, our social choices. And yet, worldviews are really significant. But I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about as a Christian, as one who believes in the God of the universe, we can become so obsessed with a human worldview that we derail our own faith. I thought about how I could illustrate this, and this is from several years ago, but it's the one that popped in my head. There was a dear brother up in Montana, and I'm not even sure, I don't remember if this was what it was called back then or not, but I think what he called this was the New World Order. Everything that happened, I had to hear about the New World Order. You know, Clinton made such and such a decision. That's just part of the New World Order. There's just going to be one world government. The UN is set up. We're all just going to, all of the nations are just going to come together. I mean, it just went on and on. And I could never come up to this guy, but he had some new information. You need to watch this video, because this is showing how the tanks are moving into this area in mid-Africa, and it's all part of the New World Order. New World Order. New World Order. New World. I had it up to here with the New World Order. So finally I sat down and said, can I talk about that? Would it be okay? Well, sure, it's happening. I said, the first thing, do you believe God's established a new world order through a kingdom that's going to last for eternity? Absolutely. Do you think that kingdom can exist in, I don't know, communist China? Absolutely. Do you think that kingdom can exist in the United States of America, the land of the free and the home of the brave? Absolutely. Do you think that kingdom can exist in a new world order? Well, they might. They might persecute the church. Have you read about the first century church? I don't know. There may be a new world order. The kingdom that I'm a part of is bigger than anything this earth can do. But this gentleman's Christianity was consumed by this whole new world order. Can I suggest to you that's where Habakkuk was? He was consumed by a worldview that was his. I think we read it this morning, Isaiah 37. God said something about the things that are happening today, I planned them yesterday. Postmodernism, no absolute truth. That theory is just permeating worldwide. Does it control our worldview? Are we so obsessed? We watched a few weeks ago as Mike talking about Isaiah in our Wednesday night class, and he urged Christians, we don't need to be consumed with all this. He even said, don't try to fix it. It's evil. It's the way the world is. We can't fix that. We can offer people salvation from that, but we can't fix it. But so many times our worldview is this has to happen. This needs to be corrected. This is wrong and that's wrong. And folks, there's always something wrong. But that's exactly where Habakkuk was. His worldview consumed his trust and his faith in God. The problem with viewing history through the optics of our own limited human convictions, as informed and fact-based as they may be, is we never have all the information. We don't have complete truth. Am I supposed to be proclaiming the gospel of COVID, or am I anti-COVID? I tell you what I am. I'm going to do whatever helps people feel more comfortable, what helps me feel more comfortable. But you know what? COVID doesn't rule my life, and it's not my worldview. If the vehicle that God selects for me to get out of this world is COVID, it's COVID. If it's a car accident on the way home today, it's a car accident. We need to be so careful that our worldview, the things that are going on around us, don't become the limitation of our faith. And that's where Habakkuk was. Now, what's really unique about him, he's got enough guts to tell God that that's what's happening in him. And that's going to be great to study that and learn how he did that. World events, politics, theology may have been contributing factors to Habakkuk's worldview, but most of it was personal. And that's the way it comes down with us as well. We can have all this logic and all this understanding that leads us to assume and to believe a certain thing, but it still boils down to, what am I personally going to do with that? And Klinger finds himself sometimes clinging to his own interpretation of history. And that's wherein the problem rises. See if you don't hear that in these first 4 verses. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. How long, Lord, must I call for help and you do not listen? Or cry out to you about violence and you do not save? Why do you force me to look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Oppression and violence are right in front of me. Strife is ongoing and conflict escalates. This is why the law is ineffective and justice never emerges. For the wicked restrict the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. He's got it all figured out. He's laying it all up to God. Here it is, my worldview, and it's right. Why is all this stuff going on? That's a very honest sharing of his perception of the history around him, even though it's inaccurate. Now, he's got all the information and the facts. He's being fair, but it's inaccurate. Why? Because the person who makes his story is out of the picture. It's a diary of a man disclosing the dilemma of his view of history being out of sync with what God he was thinking he was serving. But he's not the only one in Scripture that does that. How many of the Psalms have an expression, I cried out to the Lord, or I cry to the Lord, or I plead, or I beg? And the Psalms are doing the same things. Most of the other prophets do these same things at some point in their ministry. Here's an example in Psalm 83, again, one of our assigned readings, I think last week. God, do not keep silent. Do not be deaf. God, do not be idle. See how your enemies make an uproar. Those who hate you have acted arrogantly. They devise clever schemes against your people. They conspire against your treasured ones. They say, come, let us wipe them out as a nation so that Israel's name will no longer be remembered. For they have conspired with one mind. They form an allegiance against you. God, how long are you going to be silent? Jesus' followers were often caught in this tension between history and faith. What was going on around them? The Roman government, the Jews wanting a new leader. They were consumed with the history and the struggle that it came with faith. And I think most of the time when Jesus says, oh, you have little faith, that's what's going on. They're wrestling with something in their own worldview that doesn't fit with faith. Oh, I really can't walk on water. What am I doing out here? Glug, glug. Oh, where's your faith? And what is Jesus revealing in the book of Revelation? If it's not, then that faith can boldly face anything held within, even future history. History is in God's hands. So we conclude that problems prevented believers during their living history are the significant concerns within Scripture, and that those things have caused the Bible characters' anxiety and concern are the exact same things that work on us today. Current history holds the potential to produce in believers a sense of God's silence. Habakkuk is a unique record, however, because it not only identifies the prophet's tormented soul, but it contains the timeless and truthful answers from God. It is worth digging into it. Next time, we're going to begin to exegete some of the specifics that are contained in this book. But as last week, I do have an assignment for you to work on in your notebook this week. And here's what I would like for you to do. Last week, I just asked you to think of a time when you felt God's silence. This week, I would like for you to think of a current silence that you're sensing, that you would like to dialogue with God about. What is there right now that's presenting you with a sense of God's silence that you would welcome the opportunity to sit down and discuss with God? Think about that for next time.